Stanford University.
Today we're going to have a panel discussion, and the title of it is Sustainable Energy System, Scale, Trade-Offs, and Co-Benefits. And the reason we wanted to have this is that over the course of the year, if you come all year to this, or certainly over the course of the quarter, you're going to hear a whole bunch about different technologies, different ideas. Sometimes you're going to hear a pitch. Sometimes you're going to hear, other issues about energy technology. And it turns out that the energy system is really, really complex, and there are many important interrelationships that are going to require dealing with issues of scale, issues of trade-offs between multiple benefits, and hopefully looking for the opportunities for co-benefits. So we're really lucky today to have people from across the university who are going to offer you some of their perspectives. So they're going to basically say, well, when I listen to a talk, like at the energy seminar, these are the kind of questions that are going through my mind as I listen to that talk. And we'll hear from Dean Pam Matson, who will be talking about, where does energy fit into the context of sustainability. We'll be hearing from Lynn Orr, who's the director of the Precourt Institute for Energy, about some of the things that he thinks about. We'll hear from Steve Schneider, who of course has been so heavily involved in climate policy and the IPCC. What does he think about when he listens to these talks? Jim Sweeney, who's the director of the Precourt Energy Efficiency Center. How does he view these things? What are his burning issues? And then finally, Buzz Thompson, the co-director of the Woods Institute for the Environment. What are legal, regulatory sort of policy issues? Because what I'm hoping to achieve is that we all become very critical listeners. And we want to be able to really have a rich set of questions. And I hope as our speakers come and talk to all of us that you ask them some really tough questions. And hopefully this will give you some food for thought about some of the questions at least we have. And of course also really encourage you to develop your own list of questions, your own critical thinking skills about energy. And the reason this is so important is that we've come to understand that energy use, energy production is so intricately interwoven into our society. It's really become one of the lifeblood, the critical sustaining resources or enabling technologies for us to have the life that we live, the information-rich, the technology-rich, the highly productive, efficient society that we have today. And as we imagine now designing an energy system for the future, and I do believe that we here at Stanford and we really around the world are sitting at this sort of nexus where we do have the opportunity to say, what do we want the energy system for the 21st century to look like? We built an energy system around ideas that were initiated, more than 250 years ago, and we've learned so much more. There's so much more new science, so much technology, nanoscience, biosciences that will enable us to use a whole new set of approaches. So as we imagine designing this energy system, what do we need to think about? And obviously, we want an energy that's accessible to everybody in the world. We want people in Africa. We want people in Southern Asia who don't have access to energy to have it. We want it to be equitably distributed. With regard to our economy, we need an affordable energy supply so that we can basically not only pay for the energy but all the other things. And there are other dimensions. It needs to be predictable. We need an energy system that's competitive. The costs are competitive. If we have really cheap electricity in one place and really expensive electricity in another place, all the manufacturing might move to those places. So we'd rather avoid those dislocations. We also want something that's resilient against shock. And we also want this to be a profitable industry because it's those profitable industries that are able to really scale up and develop whole disruptive technology trends. There are also national security dimensions to this. We hear a lot about the idea of energy independence, that we want our energy supplies to be secure and robust against shocks, particularly those that might be motivated by other places that don't have our best interests at heart. And then finally, really the driver that I think is on most of our minds, that, but not the only driver as we imagine this transition, is that with regard to the environment, we want our energy system to be protective. We want good air quality. We don't want to disrupt the climate. We want to maintain water supplies and protect ecosystems. So there are all of these dimensions that we as designers of the future energy system can be working on a set of specifications, so to speak. And of course, the big challenge is that we've got 6.7 billion people or so here today. And we're going to have more. We don't know exactly how many, but we might have 9 billion by the middle of the century. We've come to understand that's likely to level off at about that, which is good news. Otherwise, it would be really difficult to imagine achieving a sustainable energy system. So as we, the designers, the scientists, the lawyers, the financial people, the investors, the business community, the social scientists, we as a collective can begin to think about the system we'd like to have. And to help discuss that, the first speaker is going to be Pam Matson.
That Sally drew there is really very similar to the one that you read about, the one that companies talk about, the one that most of us think about when we think about sustainability. You know, it's the 3 E's: economics, equity, and environment. I like the addition of national security in that mix, and I think it's especially relevant for energy. But the 3 E's, or corporations talk about the triple bottom line. And I think there's a general agreement about what we mean by sustainability. And one of the things we mean is that we want future generations to be able to meet their needs just as well as we are. So we need to be paying attention to these things. In the Stanford world, we tend to use a definition of sustainability that's really more of a goal statement. It's, how are we going to meet the needs of today's population and the population of the future. I know that 9.5 billion people, which is sort of the estimated leveling off point, at the same time that we protect the life support systems of the planet. That's our statement. The Woods Institute uses that as a statement for a sustainability goal. And that's the statement used by the National Academy of Sciences Board on Sustainable Development. How do we meet the needs of people while protecting the life support systems of the planet? And of course, that's the big issue with energy, but energy is not the only thing in that mix. There's a bunch of other needs of people that have to be met. For example, how are we going to feed this population? How are we going to get the food to feed 9.5 billion people? While at the same time that we improve nutrition, and while many parts of the population shift to more intensive types of food systems. How are we going to do that? What about water? There are about a little over 1 billion people right now who don't have access to quality drinking water, to high quality drinking water. Another 1 billion that don't have access to sanitation. So how are we going to meet people's needs for water? How are we going to meet their needs for shelter? There are still 1 billion people or so out there who aren't living in adequate shelters. Education, employment, the list goes on. There's a lot of needs. Energy, I think we all agree, is a really critical part of that mix, but there's a lot of other needs. And unfortunately, they interact with each other. And then if you take the other side of this, so how do we meet the needs in order to protect the life support systems of the planet? What do we mean by that? Well, we know that we change our atmospheric systems. And 20 years ago or 30 years ago, we talked all the time about urban air pollution. That's still a huge problem in some parts of the world. But what we used to think about as urban air pollution has now become regional in scale. Region-wide tides of smog and other air pollutants in China, in southeastern United States, and many parts of the world. So that's still with us as part of our life support system challenge. What about climate warming? Obviously, this is a huge issue and the one that usually gets paid attention to with respect to energy. Warming is unequivocal. We are on a trajectory that is going to take us past 2 degrees C warming. Hard to imagine how it won't. It could take us way beyond that. What do we do about that? What about changes in our land and ocean ecosystems? You know, if you think about land systems, more than half of the ice-free land surface of the planet has been completely changed by people, completely changed. We have numerous different impacts on marine systems, acidification because of elevated carbon dioxide concentrations, pollution coming in from land areas, overfishing, so forth and so on. All of those stresses on those ecosystems are driving biodiversity loss at rates of 100 to 1,000 times background rates. So we've got a lot of problems, and they're interconnected with each other. So the challenge is, how do we meet the needs of people while protecting the life support systems of the planet? I think one of the ways that we are thinking about this at Stanford is trying to understand where these things interact, where they become connected. So let me take an example. Let's take biodiversity in terrestrial ecosystems. Not an energy topic, but one that I guess could be related. There are a lot of people here at Stanford who do absolutely fantastic, top-notch conservation biology. That doesn't mean they're doing sustainability research. They're worried about conserving biodiversity. But there are a bunch of people at Stanford who actually worry about biodiversity in terrestrial and marine systems from the context of preserving biodiversity, but also making sure that human needs are met, that we have it available for the services providing fresh water or for food. So they're in that sustainability realm. They're in that matrix where they're worried not just about the life support systems of the planet, but the human needs. And you know, lots of people here are working on energy over on this side, on the human needs piece. Lots of us, that's what this seminar is about. A lot of people are working on energy, period. Energy technologies. It's not necessarily in the sustainability realm. But I think much of the conversation that we have here is at this interface. Where it is. Energy and climate, that cell right there. Low carbon or no carbon energy resources. And that's absolutely wonderful, but focusing just in that narrow piece, are we up? Oh, okay, that's all right, I'm done. Thank you anyway. Yep, focusing on that narrow cell can cause us to miss some pretty important interactions. And you know, the first generation biofuels are always the poster child for that. You know, corn-based ethanol maybe is going to reduce carbon emissions to the atmosphere, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Questionable depending on how the system goes, but that was the matrix. That was the cell in the matrix that was being focused on. Of course, those corn-based ethanol systems conflict and compete with land for food. Maybe conflict and compete with terrestrial ecosystems for biodiversity protection. Certainly have impacts on water resources. And so our choices about one particular energy resource can have many, many different impacts on the other parts of the life support system. And you know, there's lots of examples like that. Now, what does that mean? Means there are connections here, there are interactions that we have to pay attention to. You know, the world is a complex place. We'll never be able to evaluate all of those complexities. But what it suggests to me is that as we seek to develop new approaches for energy or any of these other meeting the needs of people goals, we ought to have a framework in mind that allows us to look at trade-offs, at co-benefits, and at unintended consequences. Are there tools that we can use to ask ourselves when we develop new energy technologies what the other impacts are likely to be? We have cost-benefit analysis, well-developed approaches, but a lot of these things don't have monetary value associated with them. So what kind of tools do we need to make those, to evaluate the trade-offs and make what will be tough decisions about what actions to take? And how can we build those frameworks into the development of policies and incentives that encourage the development of new energy technologies. So I'll end there. I don't know the answer to those questions, but I think it's important for us to be thinking about so that we don't go down too many roads that lead to unintended negative consequences, and rather go down the roads that lead to co-benefits for the multiple needs of people and the life support system. So thank you.
Okay, great. So if you guys want to step up here. Okay, so now what we're just going to go down the line, and Steve will be the next one up to talk about. So what's on your mind? How do you listen to these talks?
Well, just thought I might repeat some. They're up there. Some questions that I get asked all the time, and they're fair questions. The first thing is there any way, and Pam hinted to this already, that we can avoid a dangerous greenhouse gas overshoot? So let's take a poll. How many think there is? How many think there isn't? How many think it's a dumb question? Thank you. Because first we'd have to define dangerous. And dangerous is a value judgment. And what's already dangerous for high mountain residents and people living in Hurricane Alley and in the Arctic and in fire-prone zones like the U.S. West. I mean, we're already at the point where the increased directly observed impacts look kind of dangerous. What's going to happen to precipitation in Scandinavia or in Kansas? We don't even know the sign. So there's always going to be an argument about what that means. So how do you try to approach it? Well, first you have to be explicit about the impacts, and we try to do that, and then people will get together in Copenhagen and fight it out. So what did the EU do? I think they were ahead of a lot of people. They set their dangerous limit at 2 degrees C above pre-industrial warming. So we're already 3/4 of the way there. That means it's 1.25 above now. Where'd they get that? Well, partly by reading the literature and reading the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which suggests not that there aren't already potential dangerous things happening, but that there tends to be a real accumulation of them above another degree or so. So that gives you a scientific basis for saying, well, all right, that's at least in the ballpark. And the other reason is they look very carefully at the evolution of population and affluence and technology, the old Ehrlich-Holdren multiplier. And they take a look at how long it takes to replace energy systems and the political will needed and the investments, and they say, no way in 10 years. So it looks like 2 degrees is a heroic effort. So they picked a number that both have made some scientific sense in the impacts and at the same time looks like it's politically at least tractable with hard work. Not a bad idea. I just wanted us to remember that there's not automatic on that. And we've heard from many people, environmental groups, we need to stabilize below 2 degrees. Well, how could you do that? Well, the only way to do that would be to have the long-term emissions such that the long-term concentrations are pretty much below where we are now, if you want a 90% chance. If you're willing to settle for a 50% chance, well, maybe they could be a little bit above where they are now. And so what we're really talking about is planetary gambling with a life support system. That's exactly why the problem is so much a political problem and a problem about ethics and who did it and how much and so forth. And that all is part of it. So I think a dangerous overshoot, my own personal view, absolutely inevitable. What we have to do is try to make that overshoot as low as we can make it, as soon as we can make it, and help invent our way off it as fast as we can to get off the backside, which is question true. So is cap and trade going to help us get off it? Well, certainly without a shadow price on carbon, and Jim and Larry Goulder and Ken Arrow have been beating on guys like me for years about this. And I'm with them. I think that the market has to be an absolutely important part of the solution, because if you don't get the price right, then you don't have incentives to invent alternatives and people waste. But that's very politically difficult. Look at California after AB 32. It's really taking a long time. And it's been a difficult story in Europe, and they can't get to it in Australia, and we're going to start fighting it out. Now, I'm not arguing that a shadow price, whether you do it through cap and trade or carbon tax, and How do you deal with recycling to poor people and other things? These are all very complicated issues that are going to make it very difficult to do that immediately. So do we sit there and wait for it to happen, or are there other things we can do? And that's where I think we want to say cap and trade or whatever you want to do, shadow price, is necessary but not sufficient. First thing we have to do is say, we have climate change in the pipeline. We better help people adapt. That's number one. And they're going to have to adapt to what we can't prevent, that which is that overshoot is going to take us. However, if you take a look at that system, as the EU correctly said, once you get past a degree or so, it gets pretty tough to adapt. Therefore, we better start mitigating down to that level. And that's what the next sets in the sequence should be. I think we have to have major and mandatory, we'll let Jim talk about this, performance standards in building codes and efficiency and other kinds of things. And then we have to, as a third step, come up with public-private partnerships to literally help us invent our way out of this problem. Whether we're talking about capturing carbon or a smart grid or a whole new idea in storage, whatever it is, we have to find ways to get private capital involved. Governments are very, very good at priming pumps and very, very lousy at building technology. So what they need to do is figure out how much of that should be in the form of loan guarantees or other things. And I'll leave it to colleagues to do that. For me, this learning by doing feeding frenzy is the most important step. The fourth step to me is shadow price. Not that we shouldn't be trying, but it's going to be hard. So while we're fighting, let's do those other three. The last step would be radiative control, something called geoengineering, which I call planetary methadone. You know, if all else fails, while we try to figure out how to get carbon out of the air, we may have to do it for decades. You certainly aren't going to do it for centuries, and you'd have to if that's the only thing you did. Final question, technology leapfrogging. It's quite clear that the problem is not solved by one country alone. It requires international cooperation. This is hardly new. So you cannot have what we've had at so many of the conference of the parties before, which is finger pointing. It's the fault of the rich countries. 20% of the world's population have accumulated 75% of the greenhouse gases. It's true. And they are wed to their unlimited consumption. And then, of course, they point back and they say, wait a minute, 75% of the world's population is there. You don't have good governance. There's corruption. There's all these problems, insufficient markets. And you're going to take over and run the story. It's your fault. You know, not nice finger pointing. And if that's all we do, we're going to have a planetary sustainability train wreck. That's the track we're on. We need a deal. We really need a U.S.-China deal. Boy, would that save Copenhagen. They come along and Obama and the Chinese say, we're going to do this. Nobody else is going to be able to stand up and reject it. How do you do it? You can't use the old model, the donor-recipient. You try to sell to the U.S. Congress. I've talked there 35 times. You try to sell them transferring, $1 trillion over the next 20 years of money to developing countries. You can see how that'll play. You go to the developing country and tell them, we're not giving you money if we don't see where it's going. You're not going to steal it and put it in arms. So now you're telling them how to manage their country as a sovereign country. Everybody hates it. Am I done? And probably yes. So can we get out of it? I think so. What we need is we need to take the metaphor to step 3, public-private partnerships, to invent our way out of the problem with shared profits and, very important, shared patents. So that while there will be initial resource transfer from rich to poor through company-to-company alignments, there's a return. And that return is, as the companies on both sides start to learn from each other, they can actually start implementing and make money doing it with some initial government things. I thought this up till I found out my friends in the pharmaceutical industry said they've been doing that for 10 years, maybe longer. So there's a lot of models out there, but I don't think donor-recipient works. And if we don't have a model for transfer, then we're not going to solve the problem. So all of these factors have to be done. They will all be negotiated the first week in Copenhagen, and we won't solve the problem there, but we've got to get it on the right track, and we still have time. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Lynn, you're next.
Well, I'm perhaps more modest in the kinds of things that I think about. Thank goodness we have Steve to.
You don't want to save the world at all?
Well, no, I'd like to save the world for sure, but I'm an engineer, so I'm thinking in perhaps more concrete terms. But when I listen to a talk at the energy seminar, I'm frequently saying, Now, exactly how does this work from front to back efficiency? And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So suppose we're thinking about the transportation system. So one possibility is we've said, well, we might want to use biofuels, and Pam already alluded to the fact that this actually doesn't work very well with ethanol from corn. And let me give you a number or two just to try to convince you that that's the case. So if you just start with the solar photons that arrive to grow that plant, the plant converts about 0.6% of the solar energy that arrives in that area. And then the fraction that's harvested is maybe 35%, and then the fraction of that's sugars and starches is maybe 75%. And if you then do the fermentation, you get about 70% of the energy at that point. And now if you put this in an internal combustion engine in a car, maybe 25%. If you multiply all those things out, you get an overall efficiency of 0.03%. Now you could make this better by making the plant be more efficient, and for example, sugarcane is more efficient by almost a factor of 2, or 1.5 anyway. And if we used more of the plant and the cellulose instead of just the starches and sugars, then there's another boost there. But nevertheless, the overall efficiency is relatively low. You say, okay, fine, I'm convinced. Let's do it with photovoltaics, and there it'll be 15% efficient. You can buy those right now, but you say, well, wait. But they always quote those efficiencies in terms of peak watts and peak performance. So if you take the typical duty cycle, it's about 20% for a solar cell. So now you're down to 3% right there. And then there's the grid, 93%, the battery efficiency in the vehicle, so that's, you could 80 or 85%. The electric motor and drivetrain, probably 75%, maybe even a little better than that if you've done well. If you multiply all those out, and it's 1.7% efficient. Okay, it's better by a fairly big margin, but it's actually distressingly low still. So I think what that says is there's a huge opportunity for smart people to think about how we get in the system and make these conversion efficiencies better, and think about maybe not converting it so many different times. Every one of those has a thermodynamic hit, and if we think about efficiency as we do that, that's one piece of it. But it's not the only factor. Cost matters too. Plants assemble themselves. Solar cells hardly ever do that. So they cost more, and there'll be issues for plants. It's water and land use and the trade-offs against food, as Pam pointed out. For solar cells, it might be toxics, cadmium telluride, for example. The same thing to go with the batteries that I put in that electric car that we were driving a moment ago. So there are lots of other considerations, and cost really does matter in this, because we're talking about, one, changing the world's energy systems, and they are huge. I mean, really, these are very, very big, complex systems, and we need to change them in ways that the economies will be willing somehow to pay for as we go along. So cost does matter. So this is just another way of saying the kind of matrix of things that Pam and talked about and Sally talked about, as a way to try to put these in a kind of a framework. But that's what I'm always trying to do when I'm trying to listen to our colleagues or speakers from the outside as they tell us how their technology is going to absolutely fix the problem. And another example of in the electric vehicle arena, and I don't mean this as critical of electric vehicles at all. I have a PV system and I have some excess capacity, so the minute I can buy an electric vehicle, I'm going to do it. But if we change the system to use electricity for transportation in a very big way, it's not enough just to do that. We also have to think about how the electricity is generated. So if we do all that with 52% coal still in the mix, in California, our fraction of coal is only about 20%, so we actually end up better with an electric vehicle if we can meet the generation requirements. But But that's not necessarily so good on the East Coast, where much bigger fraction of the nighttime power is coal. So it's a big, complicated system. We need to work on it lots and lots and lots of ways. There's no single solution in my view, and we're going to need it to be, if we want it to be secure and robust and reliable, then it needs not to have everything dependent on one or two kinds of sources and conversions. So that gives us lots of room to do better, and if we are smart, we'll attack this in lots of different ways. And I'm finished.
Okay,
So,
all right, great.
Maybe even within my allotted time.
Very good, thank you. Okay, all right, Jim.
Lynn and I actually asked very similar questions, but superficially they may sound very different, because often we use different language for some of the same issues. But when I sit and listen to somebody who's talking about their favorite solution to the energy problem, and you hear a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about how their particular thing is going to make a world of difference, I want to ask questions of scale, viable scale, and will this be adopted by people who, after all, are the ones that have to adopt any system, and will it be adopted at scale? And there's a couple of things that are related to that. The first is you'll often hear, and I'll give you a couple of my examples of it. You may disagree with the examples, but illustrate the point. You'll often hear about things that you may characterize as, this is a wonderful niche opportunity where a nice entrepreneur can get a lot of profit, or they can actually support their own income they can get income for them and maybe for 3 of their friends. But if they do this, will it make any significant difference to the energy system whatsoever? And if the answer is profitable, but it won't make any difference whatsoever, I think of, well, I wish them well. I hope they get a good income from whatever they're doing. But I want to recognize that this shouldn't be an essential element of public policy to try to solve the problem. I'll take one example. I've got a friend who produces biofuels by going around to companies like McDonald's and say, let's give me some of your old oil and I'll clean it up and put it in cars. It's profitable. He's got a profitable little company there. You know, I wish him well. I don't think that recycling the biofuels from the excess grease from McDonald's is really going to be fundamental to solving the energy problem, even though it's a niche opportunity. So it's one of those things that, as we evaluate it, you've got to evaluate its scale. Another example of this, that again, people can disagree with me, but I hear a lot of people who are excited about wave energy. Now, as I start asking what's the potential for getting significant amount of electricity from wave energy, I keep concluding that maybe some company can make some profit on it, particularly if they get a heavy subsidy. But otherwise, it probably won't make a difference. And then I remember the other rule is that things that you can heavily subsidize things at a very tiny scale without breaking the fiscal system or without getting great resistance amongst those people who are paying the cost. Once it gets to a large enough scale that it makes a difference, heavy subsidies become not viable. They're not sustainable. The system breaks. So again, you've got to pay attention to whether it's a niche opportunity. The second thing I ask is the solution, if it's offered on a marketplace in a market economy, and I'll submit that virtually all economies in the world now are market economies. China certainly is. US certainly is. Virtually all the Asian and European countries are market economies. Will there be enough buyers for this solution to be viable? that's two-sided issues. One, will it stand on its, will the economics of it allow it to stand on its own without continuing subsidy when it gets to be a large scale? If the answer is no, you've got to ask the question, well, is there a reason for subsidizing it at large scale? And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes there's important national security implications or environmental implications of the technology or the technologies it's subsidized for, that it really makes it worthwhile to say, I'm going to make a national commitment to keep funding this, even though it won't stand itself on the marketplace. But that becomes a very significant commitment. The second issue is not just the pure economics. We find that a lot of solutions that sound good have behavioral barriers, not simply the economic barriers, but behavioral barriers. For example, many people put programmable thermostats in their house. However, the data we have suggests that upwards of 70% of the programmable thermostats have never been programmed. Now, for those of you who are old enough to remember VCRs, you remember a VCR that was flashing 12, 12, 12, because nobody figured out how to program that so it actually recorded. Programmable thermostats have the same character. You've all seen the McKinsey curve that shows vast amount of negative cost options. I think that qualitatively that's right, although I have some quibbles with some of the specific numbers. But if you drew that curve 20 years ago, it would have looked the same for the same options. If you have negative cost options that are sitting on the table for 20 years and they're low-lying fruit and nobody picks the fruit over 20 years, there's got to be some behavioral reasons for it not to happen. And that means you've got to pay attention to that. So what I'd like to listen for is, look, is this viable at scale, not just a niche? Will it be viable in the marketplace because of the economics work? And are there behavioral barriers that get in the way of adopting that solution? And if it looks like a good solution at scale, but it's not going to happen behaviorally, then I want us to focus attention on how do we break those behavior barriers? How do we go beyond it? Is there a way of breaking it, those barriers? Or do we just say, interesting behavior barriers and go away and being pure academics? Or do we ask, are there ways of doing it? For example, right now, and I'll end quickly, I'm exactly 7 minutes now, is a behavioral barrier on use of electricity. Basically, nobody knows the mapping from your air conditioner or lights or computers or other technologies on what the electricity cost is. Right now, we're getting smart meters in there, and we're going to have home area networks that'll have information capabilities. That's the way we're breaking that barrier. Hopefully, but we need a lot of behavioral research to get there. So those are the questions I tend to ask when I sit there in the back of the room evaluating the technology, the solutions that people are giving. That, and I'll end.
Thank you. Okay, next up, Buzz.
So I'm a lawyer by training, and that means that, number one, I approach these things from a very practical standpoint. And when I hear people standing up here talking about new technologies or the new technologies which are possible, the very first question I ask is whether or not we have the public policies in place that are actually going to permit us to develop, adopt, and then implement those particular technologies. So one of the first questions I ask myself is whether or not we have the public policies in place which are going to be able to support the type of fundamental research and the type of commercialization efforts that all of the members of this panel up here and all of you in the audience realize that we need. And I get worried when I hear Jim talk about scalability of subsidies, because the bottom line is we're talking about a great deal of money that we're going to need to invest in the current technologies and the technologies which are 20 and 30 years out on the horizon. And the amount of money that we have been investing in fundamental energy research has actually been declining over the past several decades. So how do we reverse that and actually get the amount of money that we need in this particular area? Second of all, once you get the technology out there, you have to get people to adopt it. There has to be demand for that particular technology. And because there are some aspects of our economy, such as the impact of carbon dioxide emissions on the atmosphere, which are not priced by the economy, that means that we need to have public policies in place which help drive the demand for low carbon technologies. That's why it's important that we address the carbon problem. That's why it's important that we have renewable portfolio standards and other policies that help drive that particular demand. But I also worry that even if we have that demand, are we actually going to be able to implement those technologies? So one of the things that you're seeing today, as we are seeing a growth in the use of solar technology, of wind technology, is that every time somebody plans to site any of that technology today, somebody begins worrying about the implications of those siting decisions. Similarly, if you need to set up a grid system which will actually be able to utilize those technologies, again, anytime someone suggests expanding our current grid system in order to bring those online, there is going to be somebody who is opposing that. And it turns out that we've been extremely effective over the last 20 or 30 years developing systems that permit people to oppose things. And what we need to be able to do is to turn that around so that we can actually help facilitate the siting and integration of new renewable technologies. So if I get past those particular set of concerns, it's a great technology, but we have the policies in place to, again, fund the research and then have those technologies implemented. The next thing I do is I start thinking about the grid that Dean Matson put up earlier. And as a lawyer, I'm also trained to worry, and I'm trained to think about all the potential problems that could exist with anything new that we're trying. So I'll look at a technology and I'll say, okay, that technology looks fairly good from a carbon standpoint, but what is that technology's implications going to be for local air pollution? What is its implications going to be for water resources, for local land assets, for potential exposures to toxins? And then I worry whether or not there's any agency that can actually think in an integrated, holistic fashion about all of those various aspects of any particular technology. And unfortunately, again, our current governmental system is not set up to think holistically about a particular technology. Let me just give you two examples of that. One is the use of MTBE in gasoline. As most of you probably know, MTBE came into use after we phased out lead, and also to help in producing reformulated gasoline that helped on the air toxic side. At the time that EPA was phasing out lead and was thinking about what the potential implications of that were, they did think about MTBE, but because the group within EPA that was thinking about it was the air group within EPA, they thought about MTBE from the standpoint of potential air pollution, and the bottom line was that they didn't see any concern there. But no one within EPA actually thought about its potential implications for groundwater. And this is our problem in our governmental agencies today. We are highly fragmented with different agencies thinking about different aspects of a technology. And even within a particular agency, with different groups within the agency worried about different aspects of it. So I worry about, when I think about Dean Matson's grid, whether or not there's any agency out there that actually thinks about it as a grid rather than just seeing their own particular box and focusing on that box. And then once I get past that, I get really depressed because at that stage, I then start thinking about our political system and whether or not our political system can actually deliver on the type of solutions that, for example, somebody like Steve Schneider wisely suggests. And the things that worry me are that, number one, our political system has a bias against pain. If you look at the way in which Congress or state legislatures act, what they don't want to do is impose costs. Even if you can show somebody that by actually paying for something new today, maybe it's the development of new energy technology, that there will be a payoff down the road. Most people will prefer to avoid the pain today. They're very bad at making those sort of trade-offs. There's a conservative bias in our political system. It's very easy to kill things off in our political system. As I mentioned earlier, if there's a new siting project for a renewable technology, it's very easy to kill that particular siting. It's much more difficult to facilitate new technologies, new approaches. Our political system has a short-term perspective. Most of our legislators are around for a very short period of time, so they don't think in the long-term spans that we need to be thinking. There are strong interest groups in our political system that can easily capture something. You put money out on the table, and everybody wants a part of that money. So it's not surprising that when we think about money for new energy, for example, that a lot of it goes to corn-based ethanol, because the agriculture lobby is extremely strong, and they want a share of that money like everybody else. And finally, our system today is highly polarized. A number of you probably know about the League of Conservation voter ratings. Each year they rate members of Congress. They also rate local state legislators. If you go back to 1970 and you look at League of Conservation voter ratings of members of Congress, you found that Republicans and Democrats weren't very far apart. You found that at that point in time, the average Republican rating was about 45%, the average Democratic rating was about 55%. Higher percentage is better, at least from an environmental standpoint. That was pretty much the same until 1994. And in 1994, those lines began to diverge until today. The average Democratic LCV rating is about 95%. The average Republican rating is about 7%. The highest, if I remember a couple of years ago, the highest LCV rating for a Republican senator was John McCain at about 17, 18%. So if you wonder why it is difficult for us to get consensus on anything today, you just need to look at how highly polarized these things are. But let me just end on a more positive note, which is there is a lot of evidence out there that if you want to try to convince people that they need to address climate change and pursue some of these options, that the best place to start is with the solutions. If you can show people that there are solutions to a problem and that those solutions are workable, then it's a lot easier after that to convince them that there's a problem and get them to actually invest in that particular solution. So the type of presentations we'll be having here over the next several months are going to be crucial in solving some of the problems I just mentioned. Sally.
Great, thank you. So what I'd like to do now is really open it up. We have actually quite a bit of time for questions or comments, or how do you look at when you listen to the speakers? What are the kind of questions you have? And yep, okay. How about over there?
Yeah. So sometimes there are things which are structural issues. They're not necessarily psychological or behavioral. For example, a structural issue is that for commercial buildings, the insulation generally is put in by the building owner, but the building renter is the one who benefits by lower energy costs. So you have to somehow align the costs with the benefits. In terms of, for example, electric cars, if you had cars that were smart grid enabled, we could allow that to absorb more renewable energy because you could adjust the charging rate based on how fast the wind blew. So there are things like that that are sort of synergies that we create, structural things we can create, realignment that allow us to attack the negative parts of the McKinsey curve that you might not otherwise be able to deal with.
Actually, I fully agree with it. When I say behavioral issues, I mean a broad range of things like the principal agent problem that you're talking about in homeowners. And so, for example, since it is a legitimate problem that there's a difference between somebody who owns a building and somebody who rents it, then you can think of ways that you can start dealing with that structure. By the way, the numerical evidence is very strong in California that this is not just a theoretical proposition. If you look at, in single-family homes, the difference between owner-occupied versus rental homes on energy-efficient technologies such as ceiling insulation, double-pane windows, things like that, is about 2-to-1 difference between implementation of those energy-efficient options, with the owner-occupied homes having about twice the implementation of those objectively energy-efficient options as opposed to the ones that are rentals. So again, I agree that there are those structural issues, and therefore we've got to be figuring out how to deal with those structural. One can be an information issue, but as I think about people renting a house, you say, well, I'm going to rent a house. I'm going to just go inspect the whole house and get the whole history of energy efficiency before I decide whether I'm willing to buy it at that time. Should the market work? They said, that's great, but in the interim, while you're doing it, we just rented it to somebody else. So we've got to attack those, but those are very important issues that you raised.
Okay, no, let's move on. Let's move on to another question. Actually, could you go to the mics? That would be really great. And actually, if you want to just line up behind the mics, and then, Steve had a short comment.
Just a very brief answer to that.
Just 1 second.
Is we've all agreed that markets are part of the story, but they're not the whole story. They have to be mixed with a regulatory environment. And you're talking about air pollution that affects people's lives, the fact that renters are short-lived, but you have to build the property so the whole community benefits over time. If there isn't a regulatory capacity as there is in California, I think you will be way short of the mark, especially, as I said in my sequence on the early part, with performance standards. Imagine the traffic lights and speed limits without cops and judges. I mean, it simply doesn't fly. Markets are part of the story, but rules are also part of the story.
Right. But that 2-to-1 difference is not solved by the California regulation. That's California data I was giving.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Okay.
But it's much worse in Texas.
Okay, all right. So let's move
Where they
over
have
here
no
to
rules.
Always works in
to the gentleman in the green shirt. I think he was first. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question for Professor Sweeney. You addressed the idea of making significant difference instead of insignificant. I was wondering if you thought it possible for there to be a critical mass of insignificant efforts to form a significant effort or difference.
Yeah, and that's an important issue. In the area that I tend to work in energy efficiency, there really are no silver bullets. There may be not even a lot of silver buckshot, but there's a lot of silver birdshot. That there's a lot of individual actions. So you've got to ask whether in the given area there is a possibility of cumulatively working at a scale. So I don't want to suggest that any one solution can work it. But even at that point, there's a difference between insignificant impacts and a lot of relatively small things that collectively add up to something big. For example, individual lights. Each one doesn't make a difference, but the lighting system as a whole, we can take 10% off the electricity use by going to the more efficient lighting system. And a lot of those things together can be very important.
I'll say a little about that too. So I think to the extent that we can develop an infrastructure that can accept multiple inputs, like if we have a transportation fuels that can take some from algae-based fuels and some from cellulosic ethanol, and so if we can gather a number of individual solutions into a common infrastructure, then I think it gets to be practical. If they each require their own completely different infrastructure, I think it gets to be more challenging because we have to pay for the infrastructure too. So I think that's a really interesting question about sort of co-benefits. What are those core infrastructures, such as an electric grid, that we could develop that would have multiple needs and allow many more niche solutions to contribute to the big solution? So anyway, we'll move to this mic, and we're going to go back and forth between the two mics. Okay.
Okay.
And please identify yourself.
My name is Sam Ramirez. I'm a senior and a mechanical engineering student. So my question starts with this statement. Kind of the rules and metrics of our economic systems dictate what happens in our economy. So if you want to promote GDP growth, you would use more natural capital or build more products, even if that has negative impact on the environment and on people's health. And I'm wondering what role can new metrics that say promote increasing human welfare while decreasing carbon emissions and environmental damage can play to address these issues?
So who up here wants to take a crack at
Yeah,
that?
I think I think they can be significant, but second order in consequence. The political discussions are driven by aggregate measures like gross domestic product and so forth. Individual corporations and individual decision makers like you and me when we buy their cars are not so driven by those aggregate statistics. So that if you go to something that instead of gross domestic product, you can go to one of those many other measures that more accurately look at environmental degradation as a cost, and you aggregate it together. That's very helpful for the political debate and for the comparison between nations. But unless you implement those differences and incentives for individuals, or you somehow get a cultural change or deal with the systems area that is motivated by that, simply having the aggregate statistic which more accurately measures what's going on, in my belief, is a second order effect. You've got to take that big picture down to what's motivating individuals and individual systems of people in order to make a first order impact, even though I'd never argue about against getting a more accurate measure of the overall amount of economic activity.
Yeah, Pamela, you want to?
I agree with that. You probably know that Partha Dasgupta and Ken Arrow and Larry Goulder and others at Stanford are working very hard on the equivalent of GDP for natural resources, environment, sustainability issues more broadly. And I think it's a very important thing for nations to have as an informing piece. But I also think that there are wonderful opportunities for metrics at the scale of individual decision making. I think Jim mentioned this in his earlier statements, that in basically informing decision makers about a variety of costs associated or benefits or co-benefits associated with decisions that you make is something that we don't do very well at all. And I think that those kinds of metrics, if I think about a research agenda, those are on the research agenda for informing decision-making around sustainability. But we don't have them.
So Buzz, do you want to?
No, I was just going to say, I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic than both Jim and Pam that having the type of national sustainability metrics that people are working on could make a difference. One of the things you see in the political process is that people get very focused on numbers. And right now, we don't have a good set of metrics that we can use to show the problem with particular policies. And I think the development of those metrics is going to be essential in beginning to change what it is that we focus on in the political process. And that, in turn, will then develop policies that can help change individual behavior.
But to make it work, there has to be some sort of objective credibility to the standards. The things that Pam is talking about is trying to say, can we get something that an objective measure of environmental cost or depletion of resources as all costs? That's fine. There's a host of such other metrics that are already out there. Many of them have their own political spin that go beyond the objective. They're saying, okay, a measure we want to measure the degree to which men and women have equality, and that is a measure of GDP, and the degree to which we have equality of income distribution. Once you go to those things that are heavily value-laden, then the set itself loses credibility as objective.
Wait a minute, Jim. Come on, value-laden? What's more value-laden than $1, one vote? which is exactly what a GDP measure is. If that's the objective function for the society, then you're saying that we're going to optimize the maximum size of the product. And that is not what a lot of people believe to be the proper function of government.
But
I'm not saying pro or con, I'm just saying that is also a very value-laden position.
That's not how the economy works, is $1, 1 vote. People make it sort of incentive. At the political process, I think you got it wrong. $1 never buys you 1 vote. It costs you about $100 million to buy that vote.
No, I didn't mean electoral votes. I meant in terms of weighing things.
Oh, I know what you meant,
Okay.
Steve.
Since I'm the moderator, I'll get the last word on this topic. I really do wish we had another metric of human well-being or environmental well-being, and it's very challenging, and I think that that's an aspirational target for us here and all of you out there to develop that becomes accepted and credible, and we don't have one yet, but there are lots of ideas. Anyway, so that being the last word. Okay, a question over here.
Yes, I'm an emeritus professor of physics, and what I missed in the discussion, as a physicist, I always look at time scales. And the first time scale that comes to mind is that there's enough coal to last us for 500 years if we just continue going. And it's cheap and it's not going to change very much. And the second landmark is about 100 years. In 100 years, we really don't know where we'll be. Fusion or whatever may have been practical by that time, and who knows. But I think generally the discussion, most people would agree that 50 years we want to have gone pretty well cold turkey on fossil fuels, or fossil fuels that are dirty in their generation. Industry, private sector tends to work much more on 10 or 20 years. They're unlikely to worry about 50 years from now. And what I find the most interesting is that one will probably need bridging technologies. One will need technologies that are fairly certain to get us off coal and fossil fuels within timescales of 50 to 100 years, but don't necessarily have to be continued for 1,000,000 years or 1,000 years. And, you know, just one example is clearly nuclear. Nuclear as a bridging technology seems to me about the only real one that is on the horizon at this moment. But I would just like to get a discussion in the kind of, it doesn't have to be nuclear, but...
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Lynn,
Yeah, well,
do you want
you can
to
imagine
address that?
a variety of bridging technologies. For example, if you chose to replace the oldest, least efficient coal-fired power plants with natural gas-fired power plants, you'd reduce the emissions of CO2 from them per unit of electricity by about a half. Okay, it's not cold turkey by any means, but it's, you know, it's a step in the right direction. The carbon capture and storage is another version of that. That's again, it can't be the only thing we do because it's the volumes are too huge. For baseload power, it's hard to see what's better than nuclear power, even as we look to add big quantities of intermittent resources like the sun and wind. And presumably with a better grid and storage as well. So I think it's certain that we will have an evolution of technologies. And one thing that we have to worry about too is the rate at which you can penetrate these markets. These are big markets, and it takes a long time to replace all the power plants on the planet. So I think you're right that there will be a sequence of technologies, and some we may not necessarily go directly to zero carbon in them, but we need to get there in the end.
Okay, thanks.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.